I'd just kicked back at my grandfather's lakeside cabin, ready for paradise, when the HOA president barged in, wielding her rulebook like a battle axe. 30 days to clear out, she snapped, her clipboard trembling with smug authority. Oh, honey, you think you're kicking out some random freeloader? You're about to unleash a mess this lake hasn't seen in ages. She's got no idea what's tucked away in this cabin. Secrets I'm spilling to you fine folks watching. Let's just say when I leave it won't be with a sad wave, and her precious HOA might need to rewrite their rulebook to include beware of things that creep. Buckle up, because this lakeside drama is about to get wilder than her book club's wine nights. You won't want to miss it. As a technical documentation editor working remotely, Willamere Lake seemed like the perfect escape from city chaos. The 1970s cabin had everything I needed: solid bones, a stone fireplace, and windows overlooking water that stretched like glass toward distant hills. My daily routine was simple: coffee at dawn, work at the kitchen table overlooking the lake, evening fishing from the old dock my grandfather built with his own hands. For 6 months, I lived in blissful ignorance that anyone could challenge my right to be there. I edited engineering manuals between loon calls, took breaks to watch eagles fish, and fell asleep to the sound of water lapping against the shoreline. If this sounds like paradise to you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you'll understand exactly what I was fighting to protect. Then Delilah Worthington arrived like a suburban storm system. Picture a woman pushing 40 with hair so artificially blonde it practically glowed, neon pink fingernails that could cut glass, and a Live, Laugh, Love t-shirt that somehow made those words sound threatening. She marched onto my property wearing white sandals and an N95 mask. This was 2023, mind you. Carrying a clipboard like it was a royal decree and a measuring tape like it was a sword. "Excuse me," she announced without actually excusing anything. "I'm conducting a property compliance inspection." I watched from my porch as she stomped around my cabin, measuring distances that had been the same for 45 years, taking photos of everything from my weather vane to my vegetable garden, muttering into a voice recorder about violations and non-compliance. "I'm afraid your structure is too close to the waterline," she declared, approaching with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered actual resistance. "This violates our setback requirements by at least 12 feet. That fire pit lacks proper permits, and frankly, this entire aesthetic doesn't align with community standards. You're looking at multiple code violations, Mr. Thornton." I blinked, genuinely confused, but trying to stay polite since this was my first real interaction with the homeowners association. "I think there's been some mistake," I said, ducking inside to grab the deed from the wooden box on my mantel. My grandfather had preserved these documents with the kind of care reserved for family heirlooms, wrapped in tissue paper and stored in a temperature-controlled environment. "Here's the original property documentation from 1978. Everything here was built according to regulations at the time." Delilah barely glanced at the yellowed papers before dismissing them with a wave that set her gaudy bracelets jangling like an alarm system. "Old papers don't matter anymore," she said with the kind of absolute certainty that makes you question your own sanity. "We have new rules, implemented by the current board. These documents are essentially worthless against modern community standards." The way she pronounced modern community standards made it sound like my cabin was a plague upon the neighborhood, a relic from some barbaric era when people didn't understand the importance of uniform mailbox colors and regulation fence heights. She pulled out an official-looking folder and handed me a stack of papers. "You have 30 days to bring this property into compliance or face eviction proceedings. I'll be back next week with additional documentation." As Delilah clip-clomped away in those ridiculous sandals, leaving me holding suddenly worthless papers, my neighbor Donovan Flynn materialized beside me like some kind of guardian angel with beer. Donovan was a classic car mechanic with honest calluses, genuine smile lines, and the kind of straightforward manner that made you trust him immediately. He popped open a Budweiser and handed me one from his portable cooler. "Welcome to the neighborhood wars," he said, shaking his head as we watched Delilah's white SUV disappear around the corner. "You just got your first taste of our self-appointed suburban dictator. She's been on a mission to upgrade the community ever since she got re-elected as HOA president last year. That crusade of hers has casualties. The guy who used to live in your cabin sold and moved just to escape her harassment. Charlie lived here for 15 years, Donovan continued, settling into one of my porch chairs like we'd been friends for decades. Raised his kids in that cabin, taught half the neighborhood to fish off your dock, hosted barbecues every 4th of July. But Delilah decided his place didn't fit her vision of what Pinecrest Estates should look like. Started writing him up for violations nobody had heard of before: grass too long, wrong shade of deck stain, unauthorized bird feeders. The man finally threw in the towel and sold to your grandfather's estate just to get some peace. He took a long sip and looked out over the water that was starting to catch the golden light of early evening. Charlie warned me she'd probably come after the next owner too. Guess he was right. Thing is, Wesley... Can I call you Wesley? Charlie never had the backbone to fight back. Question is, do you? The following Tuesday, Delilah returned with reinforcements. Not people, but papers. Lots and lots of papers. She arrived in what I can only describe as full tactical mode, a white SUV loaded with binders, files, and what appeared to be a professional camera. This time she wasn't alone. She'd brought Bartholomew Grimsley, though everyone called him Bart, a man whose primary qualification for being on the HOA board seemed to be his ability to nod enthusiastically at everything Delilah said, while simultaneously looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Bart was in his mid-50s, unemployed, and according to Donovan, spent most of his time at home because his wife was the breadwinner, and he was, in his own words, between opportunities. He wore a polo shirt that had seen better decades, and khakis with permanent creases that suggested his wife still did his ironing despite everything. "Mr. Thornton," Delilah announced, her voice carrying across the lake like a foghorn. "I'm here with official documentation regarding your multiple violations." She handed me a thick manila folder that felt heavier than it had any right to. Inside were photographs of my cabin from every conceivable angle, detailed measurements, and a list of infractions that read like a novel. Apparently, my dock extension violated the Water Boundary Ordinance. My fire pit was an unpermitted recreational structure, my cabin's natural wood color was non-compliant with approved exterior palettes, and my vegetable garden was an unauthorized landscaping modification. The sheer creativity of these violations was almost impressive. She'd even included photographs taken with different lenses and lighting conditions to make normal features look suspicious. My grandfather's old weather vane became an unapproved rooftop installation, and the stone path he'd laid by hand in the 80s was now an unpermitted hardscape alteration. But the real kicker came when she demanded access to conduct an interior compliance inspection. According to her papers, I was required to allow HOA representatives into my home to document any internal modifications that might violate building codes or association standards. The document she showed me was an official-looking form with multiple signature lines and legal-sounding language about covenant enforcement and community protection protocols. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," I told her, my patience beginning to fray like an old rope. "This is my private residence, and I don't see any legal authority here that would require me to—" "Legal authority?" Delilah interrupted with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Mr. Thornton, when you live in an HOA community, we are the legal authority. Your grandfather signed the covenants, conditions, and restrictions when this neighborhood was established. Those documents supersede your individual property rights." Something about her certainty nagged at me, so that afternoon I called the HOA management office directly. After being transferred 3 times and spending 45 minutes on hold listening to elevator music that would make dentists reconsider their choice of profession, I finally spoke to a clerk named Margaret who seemed genuinely confused by my inquiry. "I'm showing no record of your property being part of the Pinecrest Estates HOA," she said, her voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic bewilderment that comes with dealing with clerical impossibilities all day. "According to our files, your lot number doesn't exist in our system. Are you sure you have the right association?" When I gave her my address and described the location, she put me on hold again, before returning with even more confusion. "Sir, our records show the Pinecrest Estates HOA was established in 1985, and your property predates our incorporation. You're definitely not in our system as a member or subject to our covenants." When I relayed this information to Delilah during her next visit, she didn't even blink. "Filing errors," she said with the same confidence she might use to declare the sky green. "These things happen when you're dealing with properties that predate modern record keeping. Your grandfather's documents were lost in a computer system transfer back in 2010. But don't worry, we have copies of everything he signed. I'll bring them next time." Her ability to produce explanations for every inconvenient fact was beginning to feel less like confusion and more like deliberate obfuscation. She spoke with the kind of practiced authority that suggested she'd given this explanation before, probably to other property owners who'd questioned. Meanwhile, Delilah had begun what I can only describe as a psychological warfare campaign. Every morning, I'd find her or one of her associates walking the perimeter of my property, taking photos and making notes. They'd measure the same things repeatedly, as if hoping the numbers would change in their favor. She started leaving notices on my door. "Friendly reminder, compliance deadline approaching, and community standards are everyone's responsibility." The woman had turned harassment into an art form, and frankly, I was beginning to understand why the previous owner had just given up and moved away. The worst part was the timing. She always seemed to show up when I was trying to work, appearing outside my window with her measuring tape, just as I was getting into a productive flow with a particularly challenging technical document. But I'm not built that way. That evening, I climbed into my grandfather's dusty attic and began searching through boxes I'd never opened. Among old photo albums and vintage fishing gear, I found something that made my heart race. A metal filing box locked with a small brass key that hung from a string tied around the handle. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Original surveys, correspondence with county officials, and most intriguingly, a letter from a law firm dated 1979 that referenced boundary disputes resolved in favor of the grantor. The letterhead was from Peterson, Hartwell & Associates, and while the paper was yellowed with age, the legal language was crisp and clear. I had no idea what it meant, but something told me these papers were going to be very important very soon. The letter mentioned riparian rights and easement clarifications, in language that seemed far more sophisticated than anything Delilah had shown me. The escalation, when it came, arrived in my mailbox with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock paper with Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association embossed across the top in gold lettering that probably cost more per letter than most people spend on lunch. Inside was a document that made my blood pressure spike, a formal cure or quit notice signed by someone calling themselves Legal Counsel for the HOA. According to this masterpiece of legal intimidation, I had exactly 30 days to remedy all outstanding violations or face immediate eviction proceedings and potential legal action for damages to community property values. The list of violations had somehow grown longer overnight. In addition to the original complaints about setbacks and unpermitted structures, I was now also guilty of maintaining an aesthetically non-conforming exterior, operating an unauthorized home business, apparently working from home counted as a commercial enterprise, and displaying recreational equipment in violation of community standards. The last one particularly puzzled me until I realized they were talking about my grandfather's old aluminum fishing boat, which had been sitting on a trailer beside the cabin for longer than some of the houses in this neighborhood had existed. But Delilah wasn't content with just legal threats. The next morning, I woke up to find my quiet lakeside street transformed into what looked like a suburban protest zone. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, had planted lawn signs at regular intervals along the road leading to my cabin. Each sign bore the same message in bold, aggressive fonts: "Stop illegal construction," and "Protect our community values." The signs were professionally made, obviously expensive, and strategically placed for maximum visibility. It was like waking up to find yourself the villain in someone else's political campaign. The social pressure that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. Neighbors who had previously waved cheerfully now avoided eye contact when they passed my property. At the local gas station, conversations would stop when I entered, replaced by uncomfortable silence and sideways glances. Mrs. Henderson, from 3 houses down, actually crossed the street when she saw me coming, clutching her small dog like I might contaminate them both with my apparent lawlessness. The invisible force field of community disapproval was almost tangible, and I began to understand how effective Delilah's tactics really were. She wasn't just trying to force me out through legal means, she was turning the entire neighborhood against me. That's when I decided to fight back, not with lawn signs or passive-aggressive notices, but with actual facts. I called every lawyer in the phone book until I found one who didn't immediately hang up when I mentioned HOA disputes. His name was Edwin Peterson, a man in his 70s who had the kind of courtly manner that suggested he'd been practicing law since before it became a contact sport. "Interesting," he said when I described my situation. "I actually knew your grandfather. We worked together on some property matters back in the 80s. I always wondered what became of that lakefront lot of his." Peterson agreed to meet me at the cabin the following Saturday, and when he arrived, I was struck by how he seemed to know the place. He walked the property line with the confidence of someone retracing familiar steps, occasionally stopping to examine survey markers that I hadn't even noticed. "Your grandfather was a smart man," he told me as we sat on the dock with the box of documents I'd found in the attic. "Him understood property law better than most lawyers I know. These papers you found? They're going to be very important, but first, we need to get a current professional survey done. I suspect Delilah's about to learn that her understanding of property boundaries is, shall we say, incomplete." The surveyor Peterson recommended was a no-nonsense woman named Janet, who showed up Monday morning with equipment that looked like it could guide satellites. As she worked, setting up her theodolite and GPS units, I noticed Delilah watching from across the street. her face growing increasingly concerned as Janet moved farther and farther from what Delilah obviously considered the correct property lines. Janet worked methodically, occasionally stopping to consult old survey markers and make notes that she wouldn't share with me until the job was complete. "These old properties can be full of surprises," she said cryptically when I pressed her for preliminary findings. Meanwhile, Delilah had called for an emergency HOA board meeting, ostensibly to vote on community action regarding ongoing violations. She'd been going door to door with a petition, painting me as some kind of scofflaw who was single-handedly destroying property values and community harmony. According to Donovan, who'd refused to sign, she was promising swift action and permanent resolution of the cabin problem. Bartholomew Grimsley, ever the faithful sidekick, had been telling anyone who'd listen that Delilah had legal experts lined up to handle the situation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at the community center, and I had a sinking feeling it was going to be a public lynching, disguised as democratic process. But I had a secret weapon now: Edwin Peterson and whatever Janet was discovering with her fancy equipment. The night before the meeting, Peterson called with news that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Thornton," he said, his voice carrying barely contained excitement, "I think you're going to want to see these survey results in person. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Trust me, this is going to change everything." Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes coffee taste better and bad news seem less terrible. Peterson showed up at my cabin carrying a tube of rolled papers and wearing the expression of a man who'd just discovered buried treasure. Janet followed close behind with her own set of documents and a smile that suggested she'd found something remarkable in her measurements. "Gentlemen," she announced, unrolling the survey on my kitchen table, "this is what we call a property law professor's dream scenario." The survey map looked like a geometric puzzle, with neat lines, precise measurements, and small numbers that represented distances in feet and inches. But as Janet began explaining what those lines meant, I felt my understanding of reality shift like tectonic plates. "Your property," she said, pointing to the bold line that traced the boundary, "extends 200 feet farther east than any previous surveys indicated. This includes not just additional shoreline, but also," she paused for dramatic effect, "the entire community boat dock that the HOA has been using for the past 25 years. Peterson leaned back in his chair, grinning like a cat who just caught a particularly fat mouse. "Your grandfather," he explained, "bought this property in 1978 when the entire development was just beginning. The original plat showed his lot as extending to what's now considered the community area. The HOA was established later, in 1985, and somehow everyone just assumed the dock area was common property. But according to these surveys and the original deed, it never was. Your grandfather allowed community use informally, but he never legally granted an easement or transferred ownership." The implications hit me like a physical force. For decades, every boat owner in Pinecrest Estates had been launching from my dock, storing their watercraft in my boat slips, and holding their annual Lake Days festival on my property. The HOA had been collecting fees for dock maintenance, boat slip rentals, and event permits for activities taking place entirely on land that belonged to me. Delilah hadn't just been harassing me about imaginary violations. She'd been operating under the fundamental misconception that she had authority over property she didn't actually control. But here's where Delilah's character really showed itself. Instead of acknowledging the possibility that she might be wrong, she doubled down with the kind of aggressive denial that would make politicians proud. When word of the survey leaked, and in a neighborhood this size, everything leaks, she immediately began a campaign to discredit both Janet and Peterson. She claimed Janet wasn't properly licensed, that Peterson was too old to understand modern surveying technology, and that the whole thing was an elaborate fraud designed to confuse simple homeowners about their rights. More disturbing was her response to the possibility that the HOA might not actually have jurisdiction over my property. At an emergency board meeting that Prudence later told me about, Delilah had actually suggested pursuing eminent domain proceedings to protect the community's investment in shared recreational facilities. The idea that a homeowners association could use government power to seize private property for the convenience of neighbors was so audacious it bordered on the surreal. Bartholomew, ever the yes man, had immediately seconded the motion, though, according to Prudence, he clearly had no idea what eminent domain actually meant. The pressure tactics intensified to a level that would have impressed Cold War interrogators. Delilah organized safety patrols that happened to pass my cabin at all hours, ostensibly checking for community security concerns. She started an email tree sending updates about my supposed violations to every resident, complete with photos of my property taken with telephoto lenses that made normal home maintenance look sinister. The woman had turned neighborhood gossip into a tactical weapon, and frankly, her dedication to being wrong with such conviction was almost admirable. But I had learned something important about patience from my grandfather's generation. While Delilah exhausted herself with increasingly desperate schemes, I focused on gathering evidence of every harassment incident, every trespass on my property, and every false claim she'd made about my violations. Peterson advised me to document everything, but resist the urge to respond publicly until we were ready to act decisively. Let her dig the hole deeper, he said, with the wisdom of someone who'd watched many opponents defeat themselves. The bigger her claims become, the harder she'll fall when the truth comes out. The community meeting was still scheduled for that evening, and despite everything I now knew, I decided to attend. Not to defend myself or argue with people who'd already made up their minds, but to observe. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies reveal themselves completely before you show your hand. As I walked toward the community center that evening, seeing the cars already filling the parking lot and the buzz of agitated conversation drifting through open windows, I felt oddly calm. Delilah had no idea what was coming, and that ignorance was about to become very expensive for everyone involved. The Pinecrest Estates Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. Every folding chair was occupied, people lined the walls, and the air buzzed with the kind of energy you get when neighbors feel righteously indignant about something they don't fully understand. The building itself was typical suburban civic architecture, beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and those industrial carpets that somehow managed to be both ugly and indestructible. But tonight, it felt like a courtroom, where I was both defendant and entertainment. Delilah had arrived early to set up what could only be described as a multimedia presentation. She'd connected her laptop to a projector, arranged poster boards around the room showing before and after photos of my property, and even had handouts ready for distribution. The woman approached HOA harassment with the kind of professional thoroughness usually reserved for Pentagon briefings. She changed out of her usual Live, Laugh, Love uniform for this occasion, opting instead for a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly groceries and jewelry that caught the overhead lights like a disco ball. "Good evening, concerned residents," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd turned public speaking into a weapon. "We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's standards, safety, and property values. As you all know, we have a situation with one property owner who refuses to comply with basic neighborhood regulations." Every eye in the room turned to look at me sitting quietly in the back row, and I could feel the weight of their collective judgment like a physical presence. Delilah's presentation was a masterpiece of selective information and emotional manipulation. She showed photos of my cabin from angles that made it look run down and out of place, compared my property to pristine lawns of cooperative neighbors, and read from a prepared script about protecting our investment and maintaining community character. She never once mentioned that she had no legal authority over my property, that the violations she cited referred to regulations that didn't apply to me, or that she'd been systematically harassing me for months. Instead, she painted herself as a concerned neighbor, trying to preserve everyone's American dream. The character witnesses she'd arranged were particularly effective. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who'd been crossing the street to avoid me, testified about how my non-conforming property made her feel safe and unwelcome in her own neighborhood. A man named Robert from 4 houses down explained how my refusal to maintain community standards had already affected his property value when he'd tried to get a reappraisal for refinancing. Each testimony was brief, emotional, and carefully crafted to avoid any specific allegations that could be fact-checked later. But the real moment of theater came when Bartholomew Grimsley took the microphone to offer his support for Delilah's position. Bart's public speaking skills were about what you'd expect from a man whose greatest professional achievement was mastering the art of nodding at appropriate intervals. "Delilah's been working real hard on this," he began, immediately establishing his rhetorical credentials. "And she's got all kinds of legal experts helping us out. She even promised me that once we get this whole mess cleaned up, I'll get priority access to the good boat slips down at the dock." The silence that followed Bart's accidental admission was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Even Delilah seemed momentarily stunned that her lapdog had just publicly confirmed that she was distributing community benefits in exchange for political support. She recovered quickly, shooting Bart a look that could have melted steel before launching into an explanation about fair allocation of community resources based on civic participation. When my turn came to speak, I stood up, knowing I was facing a room full of people who'd already decided I was guilty of something, even if they weren't quite sure what. The faces looking back at me ranged from disapproving to actively hostile, with only a few showing the kind of curiosity that suggested open minds. "I understand your concerns about maintaining community standards," I began, keeping my voice level and reasonable. "What I don't understand is why those standards seem to apply differently to different properties, or why I'm being held accountable for regulations that weren't in place when this cabin was built." I didn't mention the survey results, didn't reveal that I now knew exactly how wrong Delilah was about everything, didn't even hint at the legal complications hovering over this entire proceeding. Instead, I simply stated that I looked forward to resolving these issues through proper legal channels and sat back down. The disappointed murmur that followed suggested many people had been hoping for a more dramatic confrontation, but I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response is calm professionalism in the face of organized hysteria. The vote, when it came, was closer than Delilah had expected. 15 in favor of proceeding with eviction action, 12 opposed, with 3 abstentions including Prudence, who'd clearly been struggling with the decision all evening. Delilah treated the narrow victory like a mandate from heaven, immediately launching into plans for swift legal action and permanent resolution of this ongoing situation. As people filed out of the community center, I noticed the dividing lines in the community had become visible. Neighbors who'd lived side by side for years were leaving in separate groups, avoiding eye contact with their former friends. The parking lot confrontation was inevitable. As I walked toward my car, Delilah appeared beside me like a suburban shark sensing blood in the water. "I hope you enjoyed your little performance in there," she said, her voice low enough that nearby residents couldn't hear her words but could certainly see her aggressive body language. "My lawyer's been handling properties like yours for years. He's never lost a case, and he's not about to start with some obstinate nobody who thinks he can ignore community standards." I looked at her calmly and said, "Ms. Worthington, you might want to research property law before you make any more threats you can't back up." Her response was a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Property law? Honey, I am the law around here." As I drove home that night, the lights of other houses glowing behind drawn curtains, I felt oddly peaceful. Delilah had just given a roomful of witnesses a demonstration of her character, her methods, and her complete disregard for facts that didn't support her narrative. Tomorrow, Peterson and I would begin showing everyone exactly how expensive that kind of willful ignorance could become. My phone buzzed with a text from Peterson. "Time to play our hand. See you Monday morning." Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes everything seem possible. Peterson showed up at my cabin carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived several decades of legal battles and wearing the expression of a man about to enjoy his work immensely. "Today," he announced, setting his case on my kitchen table, "we begin the education of Delilah Worthington in the fine art of property law." The legal filing we prepared was a thing of beauty. 23 pages of carefully documented harassment, trespassing violations, and deliberate interference with property rights. We sued the HOA for exceeding their authority, filed complaints against Delilah personally for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and requested both compensatory and punitive damages that would make the association's insurance company very unhappy. But the real masterstroke was filing the survey results with the county recorder's office, creating an official public record that Delilah could no longer ignore or dismiss. The media attention started small, a brief mention in the local weekly newspaper's Around Town section about a property dispute in Pinecrest Estates. But by Wednesday, it had grown into a full feature story with the headline, "David Vises Goliath, Homeowner Fights HOA Overreach." The reporter, a sharp young woman named Sarah Chen, had done her homework and presented the story exactly as it was, a quiet homeowner being systematically harassed by an overzealous HOA president who didn't understand her own authority. Delilah's world began crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. The HOA's attorney, a sharp-dressed man who'd previously treated this like a simple eviction case, suddenly found himself explaining to his clients that they might be liable for damages, legal fees, and possibly criminal trespassing charges. The association's insurance company sent a terse letter informing them that harassment claims weren't covered under their policy and suggested they seek resolution expeditiously to avoid further exposure. But the real panic set in when boat owners realized they might lose access to the dock they'd been using for decades. Within 24 hours of the survey becoming public record, my phone started ringing with neighbors offering everything from cash payments to grandfather rights agreements. The annual Lake Days festival, scheduled for the following month, suddenly faced the possibility of being canceled unless they could negotiate use of the very dock they'd been taking for granted since the 1980s. Delilah's response to these developments revealed the true depth of her character. Instead of acknowledging her mistakes and seeking reasonable compromise, she launched what can only be described as a scorched earth campaign of denial and counterattack. She hired her own attorney, a man who specialized in what his website called aggressive property defense, and began making claims that would have been shocking if they weren't so transparently false. According to Delilah's new narrative, I was a con artist who'd forged survey documents to steal community property. The emergency board meeting called to address the crisis devolved into something that would have made reality television producers weep with joy. Prudence later gave me a play-by-play of the proceedings, during which Delilah had actually attempted to convince the other board members to pursue eminent domain action against my property. She kept saying we needed to protect the community's investment, Prudence told me over coffee at the local diner. She honestly seemed to believe that because people had been using the dock for years, that somehow gave the HOA legal rights to it. Bartholomew, finally understanding that his promised priority boat slip was built on imaginary authority, had what Prudence diplomatically described as a moment of clarity. He'd stood up during the meeting and announced that he was resigning from the board, effective immediately, because he didn't sign up for no lawsuit business. His resignation left Delilah with even less support and made it clear that the united front she'd been counting on was as fictional as her legal authority. The community pressure that had once been directed at me now shifted toward Delilah, with the speed of a pack of wolves changing prey. The same neighbors who'd signed her petitions and attended her rally were now calling the HOA office demanding to know how their dues had been spent on what looked increasingly like a personal vendetta. The email tree that had once spread gossip about my violations now buzzed with questions about Delilah's qualifications, her decision-making process, and whether the association needed new leadership. Peterson advised me to make the first move toward resolution while I held all the cards. Never negotiate from weakness, he said, but always negotiate from strength, with grace. So we crafted a reasonable proposal. I would grant the community a formal easement for dock use in exchange for the HOA paying my legal fees, issuing a public apology, and establishing clear boundaries regarding their authority over my property. It was generous, considering the circumstances, and it would have resolved everything quietly. Delilah's response to this olive branch was to double down on her accusations and threaten me with a restraining order for what she called stalking and intimidation. The irony was apparently lost on her, that she was accusing me of the very behaviors she'd been engaging in for months. Her attorney's motion for a temporary restraining order was so poorly written and factually unsupported that the judge dismissed it after a 15-minute hearing, adding that he was concerned about the apparent misuse of the court system to pursue what appears to be a civil matter. The final straw came when Delilah, perhaps driven by desperation or simply unable to accept that she could be wrong about anything, decided to take matters into her own hands. According to Donovan, who'd been keeping watch from his workshop, she'd been spending her evenings doing what she called property reconnaissance, basically trespassing on my land to photograph evidence of violations that still existed only in her imagination. It was only a matter of time before she finally went too far, and when she did, I was ready. The confrontation that ended our months-long battle came on a Tuesday afternoon when autumn was painting the lake in shades of gold and orange that made even the most cynical person appreciate natural beauty. I was working on my laptop on the back porch, enjoying the peace that had settled over the water, when I heard the unmistakable sound of Delilah's voice carrying across the property. She wasn't just on my land, she was standing on my dock, gesturing emphatically while speaking into her phone, apparently explaining to someone how she was documenting the ongoing violations. What made this particular trespass different from her previous reconnaissance missions was the audience. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the public shoreline, drawn by what sounded like an increasingly agitated conversation. Delilah seemed to be arguing with whoever was on the other end of the call, her voice rising with each exchange until it carried clearly across the water. "I don't care what the survey says," she was shouting. "This is community property, and I have every right to be here." I calmly picked up my phone and called the non-emergency police line. "I'd like to report someone trespassing on my property," I said, giving my address and explaining that the individual had been repeatedly asked to leave and had refused. The dispatcher said an officer would be there within 15 minutes. Then I called Donovan, who I could see watching from his yard, and asked him to please document what was happening. Within minutes, he was recording everything on his phone from a public vantage point. Officer Martinez arrived with a kind of professional competence that suggests he'd dealt with HOA disputes before and found them about as entertaining as tax preparation. He was a man in his 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd learned that most civilian problems could be solved by getting all parties to act like adults for 5 consecutive minutes. After checking my identification and confirming that I was indeed the property owner, he approached Delilah, who was still standing on my dock like she was defending the Alamo. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said in the tone of voice police use when they're trying to de-escalate a situation that shouldn't exist in the first place, "I need you to step off this property immediately. The owner has requested that you leave, and you're currently trespassing." Delilah's response was a performance worthy of community theater. "Officer, you don't understand. This man is trying to steal community property. I'm the HOA president and I have authority here." She waved her clipboard like it was some kind of badge of office, while explaining to the officer that surveys could be faked and property records could be altered by people with connections. The small crowd that had gathered to watch grew larger as word spread through the neighborhood that something dramatic was finally happening. I could see faces peering through windows, people walking their dogs very slowly past the scene, and teenagers who'd probably never shown interest in property law suddenly finding reasons to hang around the area. Delilah seemed energized by the attention, treating the audience like confirmation that justice was finally being served. Officer Martinez listened to her explanation with the patience of a saint, occasionally asking questions that revealed he'd already been briefed on the situation by someone at the station. When Delilah finished her presentation, he said, "Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but property disputes need to be resolved through civil proceedings, not by trespassing. I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this property voluntarily." Delilah's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. "I will not be intimidated by someone who's trying to steal from this community," she declared. What happened next will forever remain one of my favorite memories. As Officer Martinez explained to Delilah that she was under arrest for criminal trespassing and failure to comply with a lawful order, Prudence appeared at the edge of the crowd, looking both mortified and determined. "Delilah," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally found her courage. "Stop this. You're embarrassing the entire neighborhood." The look Delilah shot her former board member could have curdled milk, but Prudence stood her ground with the dignity that had been missing from HOA meetings for years. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Officer Martinez was professional, Delilah was theatrical, and the neighborhood got a show that would fuel gossip for years to come. As she was escorted to the patrol car, still explaining to anyone who'd listen that she was the victim of an elaborate fraud, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice was finally being served, sadness because it had taken this level of drama to resolve what should have been a simple misunderstanding. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. The HOA's insurance company, faced with mounting legal bills and potential liability for their insured's actions, pressured the association to settle immediately. Peterson negotiated an agreement that covered my legal fees, provided monetary compensation for the harassment I'd endured, and established a formal easement allowing community use of the dock under reasonable terms that I would control. Delilah, facing both civil and criminal charges, resigned from the HOA board and, according to neighborhood gossip, put her house on the market within the week. Prudence was elected as the new HOA president in an uncontested election, running on a platform of cooperative community building instead of adversarial enforcement. Her first act was to organize a neighborhood barbecue at my dock, the first community event to be held there with actual permission from the property owner. Bartholomew, freed from his obligation to support Delilah's crusades, turned out to be a reasonably pleasant neighbor who was much more interested in fishing than fighting. The legal resolution revealed something that still makes me smile. My grandfather had deliberately kept the property paperwork somewhat ambiguous, hoping that future generations would learn to work together, rather than simply assert dominance over one another. According to Peterson, he'd mentioned this philosophy in their conversations years ago, saying that real community came from mutual respect and cooperation, not from one person's ability to control everyone else. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my dock, yes, my dock, watching sunrise paint the water in colors that make every day worth celebrating. Delilah moved 3 states away after settling multiple lawsuits related to her HOA presidency. The new association under Prudence actually focuses on organizing positive community activities instead of finding reasons to harass neighbors. The boat dock has become the heart of our little neighborhood, just like grandfather intended, a place where people gather to enjoy the simple pleasure of living by the water. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply being right and having the patience to prove it. The community that once turned against me based on one person's lies has discovered that cooperation works better than coercion, that understanding your actual authority prevents embarrassing mistakes, and that sometimes the person being painted as a problem is actually the solution you didn't know you needed. Delilah taught us all an important lesson. When you try to bully someone, make sure you actually have the legal authority to back up your threats. Otherwise, you might find yourself learning about property law the hard way in front of the entire neighborhood while wearing handcuffs.